Welcome to Creepy Horror Stories. Tonight, we bring you a tale of hidden monsters and the deadly price of looking too closely at the world around us. This is the 100-Year Exposure. Please, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and enjoy the show. The dust in the local auction house smelled like forgotten basements and old wood. Elias adjusted his glasses, his fingers tracing the cold brass of the 1920s folding camera. It was a rare find, a relic from an era of silver nitrates and slow patience. The auctioneer had mentioned the shutter mechanism was jammed solid, locked tight by a century of rust, or perhaps something more stubborn. Elias didn't mind. He liked the weight of it in his hands, a solid 5 pounds of history that felt strangely warm against his palms. Back in his studio, Elias spent hours under the glow of a desk lamp, carefully prying the casing open. When the back finally gave way, he didn't find a tangled spring or a broken lever. Instead, a single glass plate sat nestled in the dark chamber. It had been exposed 100 years ago, the shutter left open, as if the photographer had simply walked away and never returned. He spent the night in the darkroom, his heart thumping against his ribs. As the chemicals swirled over the glass in the tray, a shape began to emerge from the gray void. The image was a long exposure of a busy 1920s street corner. Because the shutter had stayed open for so long, the people and Ford Model Ts had blurred into ghostly, translucent streaks of mist. But right in the center of the frame stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly gaunt, with limbs that looked like weathered birch branches. Unlike everything else in the photo, this creature was needle-sharp. Every rib, every wrinkle of its leathery skin, and every clawed finger was perfectly defined. Elias leaned in until his nose nearly touched the damp print. A cold realization crawled up his spine. In a long exposure, anything that moves, even an inch, becomes a blur. For this thing to be this clear on a plate exposed for decades, it meant it hadn't moved a single fraction of an inch in 100 years. It had been standing there, a silent statue in the middle of a bustling sidewalk, while generations of people walked right through its translucent, elongated legs.
This can't be right. It's impossible. If it's still there, if it never moved.
He grabbed his modern digital rig and a heavy tripod. He drove down to the same intersection, now a sea of neon signs and Starbucks cups. He set the shutter speed to a full hour, long enough to turn the afternoon traffic into a colorful fog. When the camera finally finished processing the long exposure, Elias scrolled through the playback. The square was empty of people, just as he expected. But there, in the exact same spot as the 1920s photo, stood the creature. It hadn't moved a foot. It was still waiting. Obsession took hold. Elias spent the next 3 days driving across the city, setting up his tripod in subway stations, public parks, and outside quiet suburban homes. He used the longest exposures his sensors could handle. Each time he checked the screen, the world he knew disappeared, replaced by a silent, hidden geography.
They're everywhere. My God, they're everywhere.
The photos revealed a secret population. Hundreds of these gaunt statues were woven into the fabric of the city. One stood in the middle of a playground, its long fingers inches away from a swing set. Another was hunched in the corner of a crowded subway car, frozen while commuters leaned against its invisible torso. They were in bedrooms, standing over sleeping couples, and in the middle of busy intersections. They were the silent architecture of the world, motionless for centuries, waiting for a shutter to close. The red glow of the darkroom felt like a warning. Elias held the latest print with trembling hands, the chemical scent stinging his nostrils. He compared it to the first plate from a century ago. The creature on the street corner had changed. In the original image, its head was tilted toward the horizon, indifferent to the world. Now, in the photo Elias had taken just an hour ago, the entity had pivoted. Its hollow, dark pits were staring directly into the lens, locking eyes with him across a 100-year gap.
I didn't move it. It shouldn't be able to move.
He set up a series of rapid 3-minute exposures in his own living room. With each of the shutter, the creature in the corner of his den grew larger in the frame. It wasn't walking. It was appearing closer, frame by frame, as if the act of observing it gave it permission to bridge the distance. The act of photography was a dinner bell, and Elias had been ringing it all over the city. Panic sent him digging through the archives of the estate sale where he'd bought the camera. He tracked down a tattered, leather-bound journal belonging to the original owner, a man named Thomas Miller. The handwriting inside was a chaotic spiral of math and madness. Miller had filled pages with complex geometric proofs, trying to calculate the trajectory of the motionless. One underlined sentence at the bottom of a stained page stood out. They are not still. They are just much slower than our perception of time, until we acknowledge them. The phone on the desk buzzed, vibrating against the wood. It was a call from the local precinct. His colleague, Marcus, who had borrowed the vintage camera the night before to study the lens housing, had been found in his apartment. When Elias arrived at the scene, the air felt thick, like walking through waist-deep water. Marcus wasn't just dead. He was standing in the center of his kitchen, one arm outstretched, his skin the color of cured gray stone. He was cold to the touch, as solid as a granite pillar, his face locked in a silent, frozen scream. Elias fled back to the busy downtown corridor, clutching the camera to his chest. He looked at the sidewalk. To his naked eye, it was a normal Tuesday. Businessmen in suits hurried past, and a woman in a yellow dress hailed a taxi. But when he raised the viewfinder to his eye, the world changed. Through the glass, the people were nothing but transparent ghosts, flickering in and out of existence. Filling the gaps between them were the creatures. They were no longer just images on a print. They were physical obstacles. He tried to walk forward, but his shoulder slammed into something cold and hard that wasn't there. He reached out, his hand hitting an invisible, leathery surface in midair where the viewfinder showed a creature's chest.
Get out of the way. I can't see. I can't see the street.
He lowered the camera and saw the woman in the yellow dress walk right through the spot where he'd felt the impact. He raised it again, and the creature was there, its long, spindly arms reaching out to frame the lens. They were crowding him, pushing the living out of his sight, turning the bustling American street into a silent, gray forest of monsters. The shadows in the corners of the bedroom seemed to pulse. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring into the gloom. He'd gone 48 hours without sleep, terrified of what happened when his eyelids closed. He knew how the physics worked. Blinking was just a short exposure, a fraction of a second where the world went dark. If these things moved faster when they weren't being observed, then sleep was an open door. He kept a flashlight gripped in his hand, but the beam only showed him a dusty, empty apartment.
I can't close my eyes. If I blink, They're an inch closer. If I sleep, they're at my throat.
The silence of the night was broken by a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't a bang or a thump, but a dry, rhythmic series of, like old wood warping in the heat or frozen joints, finally being forced to bend. It came from the corner of the living room, a slow, calcified grinding of bone against bone. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Only the lingering vibration of something that had moved just fast enough to evade the light. Retreat was the only option. Elias locked himself in his darkroom, the small space bathed in an eerie, protective crimson glow. He pinned hundreds of photos to the walls, creating a frantic mosaic of the city's hidden residents. As he scanned the timeline of images, a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. In the most recent shots, the landmarks were there. The subway entrance, the park bench, the street corner. But the creatures were gone. The statues had vanished from their posts. They weren't staying still anymore. They had stepped off their invisible pedestals. His hands shook as he loaded a fresh sheet of film into the vintage camera. He pointed the lens toward the heavy steel door of the darkroom, the only exit to the hallway. He set the timer, the shutter, and waited in the suffocating silence. When the image finally developed in the tray, Elias let out a choked gasp. The photos showed the narrow hallway behind him. Standing directly at his back, its long, spindly fingers hovering just an inch above his neck, was a creature. He spun around, staring into the darkroom's mirror, but the glass reflected only his own hollowed face and the red light.
You're right there. I can't see you, but the silver knows. The lens doesn't lie.
He grabbed the old journal of Thomas Miller, flipping through the manic calculations one last time. His eyes locked onto a date scrawled in the margin. Exactly 100 years from the first plate's exposure. He finally understood. The 100-year exposure wasn't a mistake made by a madman. It was the duration of their hibernation. They didn't stand still because they were statues. They were predators with a metabolism so slow it spanned a century. The long exposure hadn't just captured them. It had recorded the end of their slumber. The 100 years were up. The city was no longer a gallery of frozen figures. It was a hunting ground, and the harvest had just begun. The air in the darkroom felt like wet concrete, pressing against Elias' lungs. He could feel the proximity of the thing behind him, a localized pocket of absolute zero that made his skin prickle. He reached for his professional strobe light, the heavy industrial flash unit designed to illuminate entire stadiums. If these creatures existed in the realm of long exposures and slow time, perhaps a violent, concentrated burst of light could burn them out of reality.
If I can't see you, I'll make you impossible to ignore. I'll sear you into the light.
He turned, aiming the flash into the empty red air behind him, and thumbed the trigger. The world exploded into a blinding, sterile white. For a microsecond, the strobe tore back the veil. The creature was there, as solid as a mountain. It was coated in a thick, gray pelt of decades-old dust and cobwebs, its elongated limbs looking like petrified wood. Its clawed hand wasn't just near him. It was resting heavily on his left shoulder, the weight of it crushing his collarbone. Before the spots could clear from his eyes, the vintage camera on the table, the shutter fired with a heavy, mechanical finality that Elias hadn't triggered. Suddenly, a wave of agonizing lethargy washed over him. His blood felt like it was turning into cold lead, and his joints began to seize with the sound of grinding stone. He tried to scream, but his jaw muscles hardened mid-breath, locking his mouth into a rigid, silent O. The last glass plate slid out of the internal mechanism, falling into the developing chemicals by some impossible gravity. As Elias' vision began to dim, turning into a fixed, unchanging frame, he saw the image emerge in the tray one last time. He wasn't the observer anymore. On the plate, the city of Seattle was a beautiful, chaotic blur of motion. The wind in the trees and the flickering lights of the skyline. In the center of that blur stood Elias, a perfectly sharp, crystalline statue of a man, frozen in a state of eternal waiting. Beside him, the creature was nothing but a faint, wispy trail of mist, finally freed from its 100-year vigil, drifting away into the vibrant, moving world. 6 months later, the morning sun hit the pavement outside a small garage sale in the suburbs. A young man in a denim jacket picked up a heavy, brass-trimmed camera from a cardboard box. He turned the dials, marveling at the weight of the antique.
Looks like the shutter's stuck, but it's a hell of a piece. How much?
He paid the $20 and took it home, eventually prying the casing open to clear the jam. Curious, he set the camera on a tripod in the middle of a busy public square and left the shutter open for an hour to see if the old lens still worked. When he later examined the digital scan of the plate, his brow furrowed in confusion. The square was empty, the crowds turned to a soft, gray haze. But standing near a fountain, looking directly into the camera with a face full of silent, petrified terror, was a man in a photographer's vest. He was perfectly clear, as if he hadn't moved a muscle in a century. Thank you for listening to the very end. It makes you wonder what might be standing right next to you at this very moment, moving just slow enough to stay invisible. Tell me, if you found a camera that could see the unseen, would you dare to take the first photo? If this story gave you the chills, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new nightmare. Stay safe and keep your eyes open. We will see you in the next story. Be sure to check out our other videos for more terrifying tales. Remember, this is an original story written exclusively for creepy horror stories. Good night.